Thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony today. In November 2015, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs talking about how to counteract Russia's aggression across the world. It was caused most immediately by their surge into Syria and their attacks on the proxy forces that we were supporting there. But it ranged more widely: security, intelligence, economic, legal, diplomatic measures. I'd like to go through some of the measures I suggested there. Ambassador Burns, I know you stated in your testimony that you're not an economist or a sanctions expert. So maybe, Mr. Ponce, if I could just run through those discrete items with you, and then Ambassador Burns, you could clean up on the kind of geopolitical implications of that basket of measures. So first, I called for expanding individualized sanctions against regime cronies much further than they had been, but also to include immediate family members, spouses and children, so wives can no longer have apartments in Paris and villas on the French Riviera, and kids can no longer go to private schools in the UK. Is that still a feasible option?
It's not only feasible, it's part of the targeting criteria now under, I believe, Executive Order 13661. The challenge there, Senator, and I fully agree with that as a point that we ought to be pressing, is putting these dedicated resources in place where they're not getting pulled into Iran and North Korea and ISIS, which are equal national security threats, as you're aware, but that require resources to map that transfer from principal to family to close associate to front company to shell company to offshore. That takes a lot of homework, as you know, and under the legal principles that we operate under, we have to have evidentiaries in place before we can take those actions, and that takes time. So given the urgency of the threat, given the importance of the issue, we should be investing the resources to make that work.
Direct and secondary sanctions against the energy sector, in particular the refining industry?
Absolutely, and very much in support of some of those provisions in the Counteracting Russian Hostilities Act.
Reciprocal provisions of arms, so for instance, if Russia sells weapons to Iran and Syria, then Ukraine gets defensive anti-armor, anti-tank weapons?
Certainly makes sense to me. I'll defer to the ambassador on that.
Extending the long arm of U.S. law to Russia. As you know, since I wrote that article, Russia was punished severely by the World Anti-Doping Agency, not only in the Olympics, but in the Paralympics. They cheated in the Paralympics. They're hosting the World Cup next year. I suspect that bid was greased with all kinds of kickbacks and other bribes. Should our investigators, as they did with FIFA and in the Olympics, extend the long arm of U.S. law into all Russian activities?
Targeting all illicit conduct by the Russian leadership should be a priority.
Finally, one other example, there are many more in the article, extending laws in the tradition of the Helms-Burton Act or the Alien Tort Claims Act to open U.S. courts to victims of Russian aggression, theft, war crimes, and so forth, exposing the regime to reputational and litigation harms and costs.
Expanding the intent of the Magnitsky Act in that direction makes sense to me.
Okay. As I said, there are many more measures in the article, but just after giving you a flavor of those, Ambassador Burns, would you like to now give your geopolitical take on what that kind of approach to Russia might yield from Russia?
Thank you, Senator. First, I sense strength in the Congress in both parties on this issue, not so much in the White House. I hope we could close that gap, number one. Number two, we're going to have to ask the allies to do more. In 2007, I took Stuart Levy with me to meet the European allies on Iran sanctions. The Europeans were very resistant. They came around when they saw the effectiveness of what the congressional administration sanctions did with Iran. We need to replicate that on the Russia side, and Germany will be key. Third, yes to deeper sanctions by the United States on energy, in mining, and sanction more of these individuals who are Putin cronies throughout the government, and you have written about that. And finally, yes to arms to Ukraine. We've got to do more on the military side, and you know a lot about this, strengthen the U.S. military in Europe to be a deterrent to Putin, defensive arms to Ukraine. That puts pressure on Putin, and he'll respond to that. He'll understand that in a way. We'll have greater deterrent power over him.
Thank you. I have just a few seconds here, so I'll ask one final question along these lines coming out of recent news. What are the implications of Gazprom receiving the approvals and financing that it needs to proceed with Nord Stream 2 in Europe?
This does get back to the question of having Europe make the same kind of sacrifices that we're making and having an identical policy with Europe, which we do not have at the present time.
and European action matching European rhetoric. Thank
Right.
you.